In the spring of 1994, a man from the county extension office stood in a gravel turnaround in Sonoma County, looked out across 4 acres of old roses gone leggy and unfashionable, and told Della Vance that she was farming a graveyard. He did not say it to be cruel. Marcus Hale was 38 that year, fresh from a master's program in horticultural science, and he believed every word of it. He had a clipboard and a soil report, and a calm, patient way of explaining things to people he assumed had never read the literature. The hybrid teas were the future, he said. They held in shipping, they cut uniform, they bloomed on schedule, and a buyer in San Francisco could trust a box of them the way you trust a bolt from a bin. What Della grew, those sprawling, cabbage-headed antiques that shattered if you looked at them wrong, had no market left. He gave her a year, maybe 2, before the auction. Notice. 26 years later, in the autumn of 2020, a purchasing agent for one of the largest fragrance houses in Europe signed a single contract for the Rose Absolute pressed from those same 4 acres. And the number on that contract was larger than the assessed value of every conventional rose operation in the valley combined. Let me tell you about the years in between, because they are not the years anyone in that gravel turnaround would have predicted, and because the woman who held that ground did it without ever once raising her voice to the man who told her she was finished. Della Vance was 61 in 1994, and she had been working the same piece of ground above Dry Creek for 39 years. She was known for 2 things in that part of the county. The first was that she almost never spoke at the Grange meetings where the other growers argued spray schedules and shipping rates until the coffee went cold. The second was that she could walk a row of roses in failing light and tell you by smell alone which plant was running a fever of disease 3 days before a leaf showed it. Her hands were stained dark at the knuckles from 40 years of pruning, and they never quite came clean. She wore a canvas work coat older than the extension agent who came to judge her, and she drove a 1967 Ford pickup, the color of a faded barn, and the truck started every morning, and the truck ran, and the truck kept running long after newer machines in the valley had gone to rust. The roses she grew had come down to her through her grandmother, Agnes, who had carried them west in 1911 as bare root cuttings wrapped in damp burlap and newspaper, riding 3 weeks in the baggage car of a train out of Pennsylvania. Agnes had kept a ledger. It was a thick leather book, its spine cracked and resewn twice, and in it she had recorded in a small upright hand every cutting she ever struck, every cross she ever made, every plant that died and why she thought it died. Della had read that ledger so many times she could recite pages of it to Marcus Hale. When he finally saw it, the ledger was a curiosity, a piece of folk record-keeping from before the science existed to do it properly. To Della, it was something else entirely. It was 40 years of one family paying attention to one piece of ground written down, though it would not be lost. Let me tell you about the roses themselves, because the whole story turns on what they were and what the modern trade had forgotten about them. A hybrid tea rose, the kind that filled the flower coolers of every grocery in America, by the 1,990 seconds, is bred for the stem and the bud. It is bred to ship 1,000 miles in a refrigerated box and opens slowly in a vase on a kitchen table, and it is bred, above all, to look the same every time. To get that uniformity, the breeders narrowed the gene pool down to a handful of parent lines, and in narrowing it they bred out the one thing Della's roses had in abundance, which was scent. Fragrance in a rose is metabolically expensive. The plant spends sugar making those volatile oils, and a plant spending sugar on perfume is a plant spending less on the long straight stem the market wanted, so the trade chose the stem. Decade by decade, the American cut rose got taller and straighter and more reliable and very nearly odorless, and almost nobody noticed, because almost nobody buys a rose expecting it to smell like anything anymore. Della's grandmother had chosen the opposite road, not out of philosophy, but out of memory. Agnes had grown up among damask and Gallica roses in a Pennsylvania dooryard, the old apothecary lines that country people had distilled into rose water and oil for 300 years, and when she came west, she brought the most fragrant cuttings she could carry. Over the decades, the family had crossed and recrossed them, always selecting for the same thing, the depth and the carry of the scent, until the 4 acres above Dry Creek held a population of roses that existed nowhere else on earth. They were not pretty in the catalog sense. The blooms were heavy and full, and they blew open fast and dropped their petals within 2 days of cutting. You could not ship them. You could not sell them by the stem. Yet, if you stood among them on a warm June morning, the air itself was thick enough to lean on, and a single open bloom held in your cupped hands could make a grown person go quiet. Marcus Hale could not smell any of that, and I do not mean that unkindly. He had a head cold the first time he walked the rows, and beyond that, he had been trained to measure roses by stem length and vase life and shipping survival, and by every metric on his clipboard the 4 acres were worthless. He had come at the request of the county, which ran a program then encouraging small growers to modernize, to tear out their old plantings and replant in approved hybrid stock with low-interest financing arranged through the Farm Bureau. It was on paper a generous program. Stay with me here, because the trap in it is the whole point, and it caught better growers than anyone wanted to admit. The financing was real, and the agronomy was sound, and the advice was given in good faith. It was simply built on the assumption that the only value a rose could have was the value you could measure in a shipping box, and that assumption was about to cost a great many people a great deal. Della listened to all of it standing in her own driveway, with her hands in the pockets of that old canvas coat. The morning was cool, and the dew had not yet burned off the rose. And behind Marcus, while he talked, the roses were doing the one thing his clipboard could not record, which was filling the whole turnaround with a scent so dense it should have stopped a sentence in his mouth. It did not. He had the head cold, and he had the soil report, and he laid out the financing terms with the patient clarity of a man who has explained the same kindness to a dozen growers that season. When Marcus finished, she asked him one question. She asked him if he had ever smelled one of the roses he was telling her to pull. He admitted he had not. He said it pleasantly, as if the question were beside the point, and tapped his pen twice against the clipboard the way a man does when he is ready to move to the next item. She nodded, the way she nodded at the Grange, when a man said something she had already decided was wrong, and she told him she would keep her grandmother's roses, and she went back to her pruning. He stood a moment longer, surprised the way the confident are always briefly surprised by a no they did not budget for. Then he drove off in a clean white county pickup that had never once had mud on its tires, and as he pulled out he said the word over his shoulder, friendly and final, sentimental. That was the label he fastened on her that morning, and it would follow her for 2 decades. A sentimental old woman farming a graveyard. He believed he was being gentle. That was the strange thing about the whole exchange, and it would stay strange right to the end. The kindest people in the valley dismissed her with the most certainty, because their kindness and their certainty came from the same place. the unquestioned belief that the only honest measure of a rose was the one you could write on a form. Her nearest neighbor took the other road, and I want to be fair to him, because he was a good man and a better grower than the valley gave him credit for. Roy Tilden farmed 60 acres on the flat below Della's Hill, and he had 3 children and a wife who taught school and a mortgage that did not care about scent. When the county program came through, Roy did the arithmetic the honest way, the way a careful man supports a family, and the arithmetic said modernize. He came up the hill once that winter to talk it over with Della, leaning on her fence in the cold with his cap pushed back. And he told her he envied her in a way that she had no bank breathing down her neck, and could afford to keep the old plants for the pleasure of them. He did not mean it as an insult, and she did not take it as one. He simply could not see the 4 acres as anything but a luxury, a thing a person kept the way you keep a porch swing, and he had a school district's worth of children's shoes to buy and could not farm for pleasure. He tore out his mixed old plantings in the winter of 1995, and he borrowed, against the place, to do it, 60 acres of approved hybrid tea stock, financed over 12 years, and for a while it looked like wisdom itself. His first uniform crop shipped clean to the city, and the buyers loved it. He bought a new cooler and a grading line and a refrigerated truck, the color of a fresh dollar bill, and he hired 2 more hands at harvest, and the Tilden place hummed with the sound of a man who had bet correctly. When he passed Della's leggy 4 acres on the county road, he would lift 2 fingers off the wheel in greeting, and there was pity in it, the gentle pity of a man who has chosen correctly for a neighbor who has not. Let me tell you what Della was doing on her 4 acres while Roy's hybrids were winning at the grocery cooler, because it was not nothing and it was not waiting. She was distilling. Behind the farmhouse stood a small stone building her grandfather had put up in the 30s, and inside it Agnes had installed a copper still, a squat alembic of hand-beaten copper with a long, curved neck, and Della had been running it every June of her adult life. The process is old, and it is simple, and it is unforgiving. You cut the roses at dawn while the night's cool still holds the oil in the petal, because by mid-morning the sun has burned half the fragrance off into the air. You pack the fresh petals into the copper belly with clean water, you seal the head, and you bring it to the gentlest possible simmer over a wood fire that must be tended by hand and never allowed to gallop. The steam rises through the petals, picks up the oil, travels the long neck, and condenses in a coil sunk in cold creek water. The whole art is in the fire. Too hot, and the oil scorches and the run turns flat and cooked, the difference between a living rose and a memory of one, and Della could hear the change coming in the sound of the simmer before she could smell it, a low, steady breathing in the copper that must never be allowed to climb to a boil. She fed the fire 1 split length of oak at a time, all morning, never more, and she had done it 10,000 mornings. What comes out the far end is rose water with a film of true rose oil floating on its surface, and that oil is so concentrated that it takes the petals of roughly 60,000 blooms to make a single ounce of it. 60,000 blooms for an ounce. Hold that number, because it explains everything that came after. It explains why true rose oil has been worth more than its weight in gold since the courts of Persia, and it explains why almost nobody in the modern flower trade made it anymore, because the hybrid roses that shipped so beautifully had almost no oil in them to give. Della's roses, the heavy, fragrant antiques nobody would buy by the stem, were among the richest oil-bearing roses left in North America. She was sitting on a resource the entire industry had bred itself out of, and the only people who knew it were the dead grandmother in the ledger and the quiet woman tending the fire. For years she sold what little she made in the smallest possible way, a few ounces of rose water to a baker in Healdsburg who made a wedding cake. People drove from 3 counties to order. A vial of oil, now and then to an old perfumer in San Francisco, a Lebanese man named Elias Haddad, who had learned the trade in grass before the war, and who was, by the time he found her, nearly the last person on the West Coast who could tell a true natural rose absolute from the synthetic version the industry had switched to. Elias had come looking for her on a tip in 1998. An old man by then riding up the hill in a friend's car because he no longer drove, and he had stood in her stone shed in a wool coat, too heavy for June, and asked, very formally, if he might smell her oil before he said anything else. She gave him a strip. He held a single drop of her oil on the paper and closed his eyes for a long time and said nothing at all. His hand, she noticed, had begun to shake, and it was not age. When he finally spoke, he did not haggle. He asked her how much she could make. Then he asked more quietly where she had gotten the stock, and when she told him about Agnes and the train and the burlap, he sat down on the stone step without being invited, and stayed there a while with the strip still in his fingers. An old man who had crossed an ocean and a war and a continent, and had not expected to smell his childhood again on a hillside in Sonoma County. That was the first time anyone qualified to judge had told Della Vance, without saying it in words, that what she had was not sentiment, it was the real thing, and the real thing had grown scarce, almost to vanishing. I want to pause here and say that if you have ever held on to something, everyone told you to let go of some skill or place or way of doing a thing the world had decided was finished. You already understand, Della, better than the county did. You might leave a word below about what it was. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because the road ran downhill for the valley before it ran up for her, and the turn came from a direction nobody was watching. The first crack showed in 2008, and it did not look like a rose problem at all. It looked like a bank problem. The financing that had modernized half the valley came due in a hard year. Credit tightened across the country, and the grocery chains that bought hybrid roses by the truckload discovered they could buy them cheaper still from greenhouses in Colombia and Ecuador, where the sun was free and the labor cost a fraction of California's. The bottom fell out of the domestic cut rose market almost overnight. Roy Tilden, who had done everything the county told him and done it well, watched the price he was paid per stem drop below the cost of growing it, and there is no arithmetic in the world that survives selling below cost for long. He held on through 2009 by refinancing. He held on through 2010 by selling the new truck. The dollar-bright refrigerated truck sold for a third of what he had paid because every grower in 3 counties was selling the same equipment at the same time. He laid off his harvest hands. He held on through the next winter on his wife's teaching salary and a second mortgage, and Della, who saw the lights on late in the Tilden farmhouse from her own hill, left baskets of vegetables on his porch without knocking, because she knew a proud man and knew better than to make him say thank you. By the spring of 2011, the notice came, and a man Roy had known since high school stood in his yard with papers and could not meet his eye. And the 60 acres of uniform hybrid stock, the approved and modern and financed over 12 years roses, were plowed under for vineyard by the company that bought the note. Roy stood at his fence the morning the machines came and watched them do it, and Della stood at hers above him and watched him watch, and neither of them said a word, because there was no word that would not have been an insult to one of them. Della's 4 acres did not feel it. That is the part the valley could not understand at first. While the cut rose market collapsed around her, she was not in the cut rose market. She had never been in it. She sold oil and water by the ounce to people who valued the oil and the water. And that small, strange trade, which the county had called a hobby, did not care what a stem fetched at the grocery cooler in Modesto. To the bank, the collapse was a catastrophe that took 60 acres. To Della, it was weather, the kind that comes and goes over a piece of ground if you stand on that ground long enough. She kept cutting at dawn. She kept the fire low. The copper still ran every June as it had run for 80 years. Her granddaughter came to her in that stretch, and I have to introduce her properly because she is the one who carried this from a stone shed to the rest of the world. Nina Vance was 26 in 2011, and she had a business degree from a good school and a job in brand management at a company in the city that she was very good at and quietly hated. She had grown up spending summers on the hill, and she loved her grandmother, but she had also absorbed every assumption the wider world held about the place. When she came up that spring, it was half to help and half to talk sense into an old woman she thought was clinging to a losing thing. She had watched Roy Tilden lose everything, doing it the right way. She could not see how Della, doing it the wrong way, was going to do anything but lose slower. She said as much, more gently than she felt it, at the kitchen table on her second night up. Zeit, sa. The roses were beautiful, she said, but beautiful was not a business. 4 acres could not compete. The market had spoken, and even the people who did everything right had been crushed, and wasn't it time to think about selling the hill while it still had value as vineyard land? Della heard her out the way she heard everyone out, all the way to the end without interrupting. Then she got up from the table and came back with the ledger, and she set it down in front of Nina and opened it to a page near the middle, and she put one stained finger on a line her grandmother had written in 1923. Let me tell you what was on that line, because it changed the direction of the younger woman's life. Agnes had written in her small, upright hand the record of a single cross she had made between 2 damask roses, with a note beside it. The note said, "The world will always think it knows what a rose is for, and the world will always be a little bit wrong, and as long as one of us keeps the fragrant ones alive, the world can change its mind." Nina read it 3 times. She was a brand person. She spent her days trying to explain to companies what made a thing worth more than the sum of its materials. Why one bottle of water cost 10 times another. Why a story attached to an object changed what people would pay for it. And she was sitting in a stone-floored kitchen looking at 4 acres of the rarest fragrant roses left in the country, tended by hand, distilled in a copper still her great-great-grandmother had carried west, recorded in a ledger going back 100 years, and she understood, all at once and with a kind of vertigo, that her grandmother was not sitting on a failing farm. She was sitting on the one thing Nina's entire industry could never manufacture, which was a true story that happened to also be true. She did not convert all at once, and the script of those next 2 years was not a smooth one. Nina kept her city job another 18 months and worked the hill on weekends, learning the still, learning the cut, ruining 2 batches of oil by letting the fire run too hot before she understood in her hands what her grandmother understood in her bones. She was a skeptic still in the way of educated people who have learned that most romantic notions do not survive contact with a spreadsheet. She kept waiting for the numbers to refuse to work. Instead, the more she learned, the more the numbers terrified her in the other direction. An ounce of true, natural rose absolute, the kind Della made, was selling on the world market for prices that made her recheck her arithmetic. The fragrance houses of Europe. The real ones, the houses that made the perfumes that sold for hundreds of dollars a bottle, had been quietly desperate for natural rose oil for years, because the supply from the old growing regions had been disrupted by war and weather and development, and because a generation of perfumers was rediscovering that the synthetic substitute, however clever, did not have the living depth of the real thing. Della had been making the real thing in a stone shed for 50 years, and selling it by the vial to a baker and a dying old perfumer, because nobody had ever connected the 4 acres above Dry Creek to the houses in France that would have wept to find them. Elias Haddad was the bridge, though he did not live to see the far bank. He was 91 by 2013, frail and nearly blind, and Nina drove down to the city to meet the man her grandmother had been selling to for 15 years, half expecting a hobbyist. She found instead a master, the last working link to the old natural perfumery tradition of Gras, and over an afternoon in his cramped apartment, full of labeled bottles, he taught her more about the value of what her grandmother grew than her degree had taught her about anything. He explained the grades of rose oil the way a jeweler explains stones. He held a strip dipped in Della's Absolute beside a strip of the finest material the commercial houses could buy, and even Nina's untrained nose could tell that one of them was alive, and one of them was a photograph of being alive. Before she left, he gave her 3 things: a list of names, perfumers and purchasing agents in France and Switzerland he had known across 60 years in the trade, a letter of introduction in his shaking hand, and 1 sentence, which Nina wrote down in the car before she could lose it. He told her that the houses did not need more roses. They needed the right rose, and they would pay almost anything to find it, and they had nearly stopped believing it still existed. The label found Della one more time before the turn, and it came from a direction it should have known better. In 2014, the county held a meeting about a new agricultural marketing initiative, and Nina, by then full-time on the Hill and trying to build something, went to it hoping for help. Marcus Hale was there. He was past 60 now, near retirement, a respected senior figure in the county's agricultural office, and when the floor opened and Nina stood and described what they were doing on the 4 acres, the small batch rose Absolute, the heritage stock, the European interest. He listened with the same patient courtesy he had shown her grandmother 20 years before, and he said kindly that he admired the romance of it, but that boutique operations of that kind were a liability, dressed up as a business, and that she would be wiser to focus on something with a real market. A boutique liability. The 3rd time, the family was dismissed in that flat, friendly, certain voice, and the last. Nina sat down. She did not argue. She had learned that much from her grandmother already. The arithmetic would argue for them when the time came, and it would argue louder than anything she could say in a county meeting room. Let me tell you how the turn actually happened, because it was not a marketing campaign, and it was not a stroke of luck. It was a sample sent in a padded envelope, paid for out of Nina's savings. Working off Elias Haddad's list and his letter, she sent small vials of Della's Absolute to 7 addresses in Europe in the autumn of 2015, with a single typed page describing the roses and the ground and the still and the 100-year ledger. 6 of the 7 never answered. The 7th was a purchasing director at a house in Grasse, founded in the 18th century, a woman named Camille Reyes who had spent 30 years sourcing naturals for some of the most expensive perfumes in the world, and who knew, the instant she opened the vial, that she was holding something she had been told no longer existed in any quantity. She did not telephone. She flew. Hen did. She came up the hill in a rented car in the spring of 2016, a small, precise woman in city clothes, and she walked the rows with Della in the early morning while the oil was still in the petals, and she did the thing Elias had done 18 years before. She held a single open bloom in her cupped hands, and she closed her eyes, and she stood there for a long time. Then she asked to see the still. Then she asked to see the ledger. She turned its 100-year pages with the care of a person handling a relic, and when she reached Agnes's line about the world always thinking it knew what a rose was for, Nina translated it for her, and Camille Reyes, who had smelled every great rose oil produced on Earth in 3 decades of buying, put her hand flat on the page and was quiet in a way that needed no translation. What Camille understood, standing in that stone shed, was a thing the county agent never could, because she had been trained to measure the one variable the clipboard left out. She knew that the value of a natural rose absolute is not its volume but its character, the specific fingerprint of a specific population of roses grown on a specific piece of ground, and that this fingerprint cannot be manufactured, cannot be scaled, cannot be reproduced in a greenhouse in Ecuador or a lab in New Jersey, and that a house which can put a genuinely unique and genuinely fine natural at the heart of a fragrance has something no competitor on Earth can copy. Della's 4 acres were not small, they were singular. And singular in the world Camille bought for was worth more than scale could ever be. A negotiation, if you can call it that, took place at the kitchen table where Nina had once tried to talk her grandmother into selling the hill. Camille named what her house was prepared to pay for the entire annual production of the 4 acres, a multi-year exclusive contract with the price set per kilogram of absolute, and the figure she named was built on the European understanding, which is to say it was built on the 60,000 blooms to an ounce arithmetic, that the American grocery trade had spent 40 years pretending did not exist. Nina did the conversion in her head and had to ask Camille to repeat it. The contract for a single year's production of the 4 acres came to more than $400,000. For a moment, no one at the table said anything. Outside the morning warmed, and the scent came up off the rose and drifted through the open door the way it had every June, for 100 years free, the way it had always been free, while 3 women sat around a ledger and understood at last that the thing the county had called a graveyard was worth, per acre, more than the finest vineyard land in the valley. Della did not smile, and she did not say, "I told you so," and she did not say anything about the man who had stood in her driveway in 1994. She got up and put the kettle on. That was all. She had known what the roses were for the whole time. It had simply taken the rest of the world 90 years and a Frenchwoman's nose to catch up to a dead grandmother's handwriting. Let me tell you what they built from there, because the number was the beginning and not the end, and what they did with it is the part that mattered most to Della. The contract with the house in Grasse anchored everything, but Nina, the brand person, understood that the deeper value was the story made legible, and so in 2017 they launched a perfume of their own. Not a mass product. A single fragrance, built around Della's absolute at its heart, made in small batches, sold with the whole 100-year truth attached. The train out of Pennsylvania, and the burlap-wrapped cuttings, and the copper still in the ledger, and the 4 acres that refused to be pulled. They called it After Agnes. It was expensive, and it sold out the first run in a week, and the second run in a day, and within 3 years it was carried in the kind of stores that do not carry things from 4-acre farms in Sonoma County, and it was written about in the kind of magazines that had spent the 90s telling women that a rose did not need to smell like anything. The brand went global on the back of a fragrance. The entire industry had bred itself incapable of making, distilled from roses a county agent had called sentimental. On ground he had called a graveyard. They did not scale the land. And that was the discipline that made it last. Nina had 100 chances to plant more acres, to franchise the name, to take outside investment that would have demanded the kind of growth 4 acres cannot sustain. She refused all of it, and she refused it on principle her grandmother had set, because the whole value of the thing was that it could not be made bigger without being made false. Instead, they did something else. They began to teach. Nina tracked down growers across the West who still had old fragrant plantings their families had never quite torn out, the leggy, unfashionable antiques tucked behind newer rows, and the family bought their roses at a fair price and taught them the cut and the still, and a small network of fragrant rose growers grew up out of the success of the 4 acres. Each one keeping its own ground, each one singular, none of them scaled. The method spread the only way it could, plant by plant and person by person, the way Agnes had carried it west in the first place. Roy Tilden's son was one of the growers they helped. He had kept 12 acres of the family flat after the rest went to vineyard, and on those 12 acres behind the vines stood a single hedge of old roses his grandmother had planted that nobody had ever bothered to pull. Nina found them, and the family taught him, and the man whose father had been ruined doing everything the county told him to do made his first ounce of rose oil in 2019 from roses that had been standing there, ignored and fragrant, the whole time. There is a justice in that the spreadsheet will never hold. And Marcus Hale, I told you this story does not punish him. And it does not, because that is not what the ground does to people. He was retired by the time the Perfume went global, and he read about it, the way the rest of the county did, in the regional paper, under a photograph of Della standing in her rose in the canvas coat she had worn for 50 years. He drove up the hill one morning in the autumn of 2019, not in a county truck, in his own old car, and he stood in the same gravel turnaround where he had told her she was farming a graveyard, and he waited until she walked over. He was an honest man, which he had always been, and honesty made him say it plainly. He told her he had been wrong. He told her he had spent his whole career measuring the one thing about a rose that was easy to measure, and calling it the whole rose, and that he had been doing it the day he stood in this same spot and told her to pull the only roses in the county worth keeping. He asked her, an old man to an old woman, if she would show him how the still worked. She did. Of course she did. She had never wanted him punished. She had only ever wanted him to smell the rose. And now, 25 years late, he finally could. She took him into the stone shed and showed him the copper belly and the long neck and the coil in the cold creek water, and she let him hold a strip dipped in the absolute. And the senior horticultural scientist who had built a 30-year career on measurable variables stood in a stone shed and closed his eyes over a paper strip and understood at last the thing he had been trained his whole life not to be able to measure. Let me tell you about the last thing, and then I will let the story rest. Della Vance lived to be 91, long enough to see the brand carried in Paris and Tokyo, long enough to sign the ledger over to Nina, in a small ceremony that was really just the two of them at the kitchen table with the leather book between them. On the first blank page, after Agnes's last entry, in a hand grown shaky but still upright, Della wrote the date and a single line of her own, the first line, Vance had added to that book in 40 years. She wrote that the roses had been called sentimental and a graveyard and a boutique liability. by people who were not bad people, only people who measured the wrong thing, and that the roses had outlived every one of those words and would outlive these too as long as someone kept cutting them at dawn while the oil was still in the petal. Here's what I've come to believe. Walking that ground and reading that ledger and standing where the county agent stood, there are two kinds of knowledge, and our age is very good at one of them and very nearly blind to the other. There is the wide, fast, confident kind that can measure a stem and survive a shipping box and fill 1,000 coolers with roses that all look the same. And there is the narrow, slow, patient kind that knows one piece of ground and one family of roses well enough to keep alive. Across 100 years, the single quality, the other kind bred away. The first kind built the modern flower trade, and the modern flower trade collapsed in a season when the weather of the market changed. The second kind sat on a hill above Dry Creek, making perfume out of patience, and when the world finally remembered what a rose was for, it was the only one left who still knew. The hybrids are gone from the valley now, plowed under. For grapes, the 4 acres are still there. Every June, the petals still come off at dawn into canvas baskets, and the copper still runs over a fire someone tends by hand and never lets gallop, and the scent comes up off the rose thick enough to lean on, the same scent Agnes carried west, wrapped in damp burlap, the same scent a county agent could not smell over a head cold and a clipboard, the same scent that a Frenchwoman flew across the world to stand inside. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are two different things, and the distance between them is exactly the size of 4 acres of unfashionable roses that a sentimental old woman refused to pull. What is rigid breaks? What is fragrant remains. And on the hill above Dry Creek at dawn, the roses are still being cut.